I still remember the exact way he smiled when he told me to get out. The chandelier above us scattered light across the marble floors, catching the gold rim of the champagne glasses, the polished shoes of investors, the diamond earrings of women who had shaken my hand just minutes earlier. A string quartet had been playing something soft and forgettable. But the music stopped mid-note when Daniel raised his glass and turned toward me instead of the crowd. "If you're not going to support me." "Claire," he said smoothly, smiling as if this were part of the entertainment, "you're free to leave. This is my house. My company." More than 50 guests stood in that living room. Board members, lenders, couples from church, contractors who had built the place beam by beam. No one spoke. They didn't have to. Their silence did the work for them. Daniel believed humiliation was cleaner when done publicly. He believed if he erased me in front of witnesses, I would walk out quietly to preserve his reputation. What he didn't know was that I had been preparing for this moment for months, and I was not the one about to lose everything. The house was our newest model property in suburban Dallas, the crown jewel of Whitman Custom Homes. 20-foot ceilings, imported stone countertops, custom ironwork on the staircase. Daniel had insisted we combine our 20th wedding anniversary with the company's expansion celebration. He wanted lenders impressed. He wanted the church community reassured. He wanted photographs that showed stability. What he wanted most was control. Earlier that evening, I had watched him move through the crowd like a man campaigning for re-election. He spoke about growth projections and new land acquisitions, about how the company had doubled in value under his leadership. Every time someone mentioned my name, he gently redirected the credit. "Claire's been focusing on the home front. Claire prefers staying out of the financial weeds. Claire trusts me to handle the big decisions." Each sentence was delivered with a charming laugh, as if we were partners playing different but equal roles. Only we both knew that wasn't true. When he announced a new development outside Austin, one I had never seen board approval for, I felt the shift in my chest. The investors nodded politely. A board member scribbled something on his notepad. The room buzzed with rehearsed optimism. I stepped forward, still smiling, and said lightly, "I didn't realize that project had cleared final review. When did the board vote?" It was a simple question. Neutral. Reasonable. The temperature changed instantly. Daniel lowered his glass and turned toward me fully this time. "Claire," he said, in that warning tone I had come to recognize over the past year. "Not everything needs to be dissected in public." A few guests laughed nervously. "I'm just asking for clarity," I replied. My voice didn't shake. I had practiced that. He set his glass down harder than necessary. "Clarity," he repeated. "You haven't attended a financial meeting in months. Let's not pretend you suddenly understand corporate structuring." There it was. The narrative shift. I felt the eyes on me, curious, sympathetic, calculating. His daughter Madison stood near the staircase, arms crossed, watching like she'd expected this. "If you can't support me," Daniel continued, louder now, "you can leave. This is my house. My company." He said it as if it were a fact, as if history could be rewritten with enough confidence. For a split second, the humiliation hit me like cold water. My fingers tightened around the stem of my glass. I saw flashes of the early days, when we worked out of a rented office, when I used my grandmother's inheritance to secure our first line of credit, when I drafted marketing plans at the kitchen table after midnight. But I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I set my glass down carefully on the nearest table. "Are you certain you want me to leave?" I asked. He smiled again. That same polished, dismissive smile. "I'm certain." Someone near the doorway shifted uncomfortably. A woman from church touched my arm and whispered, "Maybe this isn't the time." She was wrong. This was exactly the time. I picked up my purse. I walked toward the front door, feeling the weight of every stare on my back. Behind me, I heard the music resume, thin and artificial. Laughter followed, too loud, too forced. Daniel turned back to his guests as if the scene had been a minor interruption. Outside, The Texas night air felt warmer than it should have. The driveway lights illuminated the manicured lawn, the stone facade, the place he had just claimed as his alone. I stood there for a moment, breathing steadily. Then I took out my phone. Weeks earlier, after discovering documents that didn't add up, loan paperwork I hadn't signed, transfers labeled as consulting fees, I had made a decision. I hadn't confronted him. I had consulted a lawyer instead. I had gathered copies, forwarded files to a secure account, asked careful questions about disclosure obligations, and I had drafted an email. The subject line referenced discrepancies in corporate filings. The recipients included a forensic accountant and a compliance officer connected to one of our lenders. I opened the message one last time. Inside the house, Daniel's voice carried faintly through the open doors. Confident, triumphant. I pressed send. A small confirmation notification appeared at the top of my screen. Delivered. Through the glass, I saw him raise his glass again, smiling as if he had erased me from his life with a single sentence. He had no idea he had just triggered the beginning of his own undoing. I woke up in a hotel room that smelled like starch and recycled air, staring at a ceiling that wasn't mine. For a few seconds, I didn't remember where I was. Then it came back in one clean, sharp image, Daniel standing under that chandelier, smiling while he told me to leave his house. My phone was face down on the nightstand, buzzing every few minutes. When I finally turned it over, the screen lit up with messages. A few from women at church saying they hoped we could work things out privately. One from a board member asking if I was all right. 3 missed calls from an unknown number I recognized as Daniel's attorney's office. And at the top of my social media feed was Daniel's post. He had uploaded a photograph from the party, him standing alone in the center of the living room. Champagne raised. Captioned, "Grateful for an incredible night celebrating growth and the future of Whitman Custom Homes. Thank you to everyone who supports our vision." There was no mention of me. In the comments, people praised his leadership. Someone wrote, "Strong men build strong companies." Another added, "Praying for your family." The narrative had already been shaped. I was the emotional wife who couldn't handle success. He was the steady CEO protecting his company. I set the phone down slowly. This hadn't been an impulsive outburst. It had been positioning. 6 months earlier, I had been sitting at our dining room table surrounded by tax folders when I found the first crack. It was a loan document I didn't recognize. A second mortgage taken out against our primary residence. My signature wasn't on it. The notary date was 3 weeks prior. At first I thought it was a clerical error. Daniel handled most of the refinancing conversations. I had trusted him to loop me in when necessary. But then I noticed something else. Large transfers from the company labeled external consulting services. The amounts were too high. Too frequent. When I asked Daniel casually about the refinancing, he waved it off. "Just restructuring debt to free up capital," he said. "It's complicated. You don't need to worry about it." I remember standing at the sink that night, staring out at the backyard, feeling something colder than suspicion. Instead of confronting him, I made an appointment with a corporate attorney downtown. I told Daniel I was meeting an old colleague for lunch. In that quiet office, I laid out copies of the documents I had scanned. The attorney listened carefully, then asked one question. "Did you contribute any separate capital to the company at formation?" "Yes," I said. "My grandmother's inheritance." He nodded slowly. "Then you have more leverage than you think." From that day on, I stopped reacting and started documenting. I copied quarterly reports. I requested archived incorporation paperwork under the pretense of updating my records. I forwarded everything to a secure cloud folder Daniel didn't know existed. Back in the hotel room, I opened my email. There was a response from the forensic accountant I had contacted the night before. "Mrs. Whitman, we have received your documentation. Based on initial review, there appear to be inconsistencies between disclosed liabilities and recent loan activity. We will proceed with formal inquiry as permitted under lender agreements." My pulse remained steady. The next message was from the compliance officer at one of our primary lending institutions. It was brief and professional. We acknowledge receipt of your concerns. We are obligated to review potential disclosure discrepancies. Obligated. That was the word Daniel had underestimated. Once lenders were formally alerted, the process moved beyond marital conflict. It became procedural. My phone rang. Daniel. I let it ring twice before answering. Claire, he said. Voice controlled. What exactly are you doing? I'm ensuring transparency. I replied, You sent documents to the bank. His calmness was strained now. I requested a review. You're damaging the company's reputation, he snapped. Do you have any idea what that does to investor confidence? I looked around the sterile hotel room. You were concerned about reputation last night. There was a pause. You're overreacting, he said finally. We can settle this privately. I'll arrange a temporary financial transfer for you. We'll draft an agreement. No one else needs to get involved. An agreement. An NDA. He was nervous. I won't discuss anything without attorneys present, I said. His breath sharpened. You're making a mistake. No, I replied quietly. I'm correcting one. He hung up. A few hours later, my attorney called. There's something else, he said. The preliminary review flagged an entity connected to Daniel that does not appear in official company filings. What kind of entity? An LLC, registered recently. It's tied to land acquisition outside Austin. And there are loan guarantees referencing projected revenue that hasn't been reported to the board. I closed my eyes for a moment. An undisclosed LLC meant this wasn't just aggressive expansion. It meant concealment. If lenders determine material misrepresentation, my attorney continued, they can escalate this beyond internal review. Through the window, I could see the Dallas skyline in the distance, steady and indifferent. Daniel had believed humiliating me in front of our guests would silence me. He believed stripping me of dignity would make me retreat. Instead, he had forced the process into motion. And now, the questions weren't coming from me anymore. They were coming from people he couldn't intimidate. The prenuptial agreement sat between us on the polished conference table like a relic from another life. Daniel had always treated it as a shield, something he could lift whenever our marriage drifted too close to conflict. Now my attorney ran a careful finger down the pages. Stopping at a paragraph I remembered negotiating more fiercely than Daniel ever realized. He disclosed assets at the time of signing, my attorney said evenly. But this clause here, full financial transparency and ongoing disclosure, changes the landscape if concealment can be proven. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the familiar language. Before our wedding, Daniel had insisted on the prenup. He framed it as standard protection for a man building a company from the ground up. I had agreed, not because I felt powerless, but because I understood contracts. The week before the ceremony, I had quietly added one condition. Any material misrepresentation of assets or liabilities would void certain protections. Daniel had skimmed it and signed without concern. He was confident in his numbers, confident in his control. He had no reason to think those pages would ever be used against him. My phone buzzed with a message from the forensic accountant. We have traced the undisclosed LLC. It was registered under a different mailing address, but guaranteed through Whitman Custom Homes' projected revenue streams. I closed my eyes briefly. Projected revenue meant homes not yet built. Money that existed only on paper. That entity was never disclosed in board summaries. My attorney continued. If loan guarantees were issued without board awareness, that's a serious governance issue. It was more than governance. It was deception. Later that afternoon, Daniel's attorney sent a formal notice accusing me of initiating a malicious attempt to damage the company's reputation. The letter implied I had personal motives, that my actions stemmed from emotional retaliation rather than legitimate concern. The irony almost made me laugh. Daniel had built his defense on one idea, that I was reacting to humiliation, that I wanted revenge for being thrown out of our home in front of investors and friends. He didn't understand that I had begun preparing long before that night. When he called, His tone was controlled but edged with impatience. "You've triggered a compliance review," he said. "Do you have any idea what that does to lender confidence?" "I understand exactly what it does," I replied. "You're undermining years of work." "No," I said quietly. "I'm asking why there's an LLC tied to company revenue that the board has never seen." Silence hung on the line for a second too long. "It's a strategic expansion vehicle," he said finally. "Not every move needs to be public. It does when loans are guaranteed against it." He exhaled sharply. "You're out of your depth." For years, that phrase had worked on me. It had nudged me back into silence. This time, it slid off. "Then explain it to the board," I said, and ended the call. 2 days later, my attorney received confirmation that one of the primary lenders had initiated a formal compliance inquiry. Under the terms of the lending agreement, they were obligated to review any potential discrepancies in disclosure. Obligated. The word felt heavier now. At the next preliminary board call, I listened as Daniel described the LLC as routine growth strategy. He spoke confidently, smoothly, the way he always had when pitching new developments. But a board member interrupted him. "Why wasn't this presented in quarterly reports?" she asked. "It was early stage," Daniel replied. "No need to burden the board with every detail." Another voice came through the speakerphone. "Loan guarantees aren't small details." The tone of the call shifted. Subtle, but unmistakable. Afterward, one board member reached out to me privately. "Claire," he said carefully, "if lenders feel misled, this could escalate quickly. We need transparency." Transparency. The very thing Daniel had dismissed as unnecessary. That evening, I sat alone in the hotel room reviewing copies of incorporation documents from when the company first formed. I found my original capital contribution listed clearly, funded through my grandmother's inheritance. Without it, there would have been no first project, no line of credit, no Whitman Custom Homes. Daniel had begun restructuring ownership percentages 2 weeks before the anniversary party. My attorney confirmed it. Proposed amendments that would have diluted my stake under the guise of expansion. The timing wasn't accidental. He had planned to weaken me legally, then discredit me publicly. The humiliation under the chandelier had not been spontaneous anger. It had been strategic positioning. My phone lit up again with an update from the forensic accountant. "There is evidence that projected revenue used to secure the LLC loan exceeds reported internal projections by a significant margin. In plain language, the numbers presented to lenders were more optimistic than the ones shared internally. Optimism could be explained. Inflation could be debated. Concealment was harder to defend." The next morning, confirmation arrived that the lender's compliance inquiry had moved beyond informal review. They were requesting documentation directly from the company. Daniel didn't know yet that the inquiry had escalated. He still believed the prenup made him untouchable. He believed the company structure protected him. He believed I would eventually retreat for the sake of our marriage or our reputation. He had forced me out of our house to prove he held all the power. Now the very documents he once insisted on signing were beginning to unravel that illusion. I saw Madison's post before I even finished my morning coffee. A picture of her and Daniel at the anniversary party. Taken before everything exploded. Her caption read, "Some people try to destroy what they didn't build. Proud of my dad for standing strong." The comments were worse. Friends from school calling him resilient. Strangers calling me bitter. Someone wrote that wives who can't handle powerful men should step aside. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. For 10 years. I had packed her lunches, sat through school recitals, driven her to soccer practice. Now I was a villain in her version of the story. My phone buzzed with a message from the forensic accountant. Cutting through the noise. "Claire, Madison Whitman's name appears in minority beneficiary documentation tied to the undisclosed LLC." I read the sentence twice. "What does that mean?" I typed back. "It appears she is listed as a partial stakeholder in the entity, possibly to strengthen lending terms." My stomach tightened. She was 16. There was no way she fully understood loan guarantees or projected revenue obligations. If the lenders dug deeper and misrepresentation was proven, her name on those documents could drag her into scrutiny she didn't deserve. This wasn't just corporate deception anymore. It was family manipulation. I texted her, keeping it simple. Can we meet? Just us. She didn't respond for hours. When she finally agreed, it was with a single word. Fine. We met at a cafe in a suburban shopping center halfway between the mansion and my hotel. She arrived with her arms crossed and her jaw set, looking older than she should have. I don't know what you think you're doing, she said before sitting down. Dad says you're trying to take everything from him. I'm not trying to take anything, I replied evenly. I'm trying to understand what's been done in your name. Her eyes narrowed. He said you're mad because he embarrassed you. That word again. Embarrassed. As if humiliation were a trivial inconvenience instead of a strategy. Madison, I said gently, did you review any documents connected to a company outside Whitman Custom Homes? An LLC. She hesitated. Just a flicker. Dad asked me to sign something a few months ago, she admitted. He said it was a routine trust adjustment. Something about helping with future investments. Did you read it? She shrugged. But her confidence had cracked. He said it was fine. I pulled a copy of the loan document from my folder and slid it across the table. This is what your signature is attached to. She scanned the page, her brow tightening. What does guarantor mean? It means if projected revenue doesn't meet expectations, the lender can pursue the people who guaranteed it. Her face paled slightly. You're saying I'm responsible? I'm saying you were put in a position without full disclosure. She leaned back, breathing shallowly. He wouldn't do that. I held her gaze. I didn't think so either. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The noise of the cafe faded into the background. I thought you were just trying to hurt him, she said quietly. If I wanted to hurt him, I replied, I would have exposed everything publicly already. I haven't. Her eyes flicked back to the document. That evening, Daniel called. You had no right to meet with her, he snapped. You're poisoning her against me. I asked her if she understood what she signed. She trusts me. She should, I said. But trust doesn't replace disclosure. You're turning this into a spectacle, he said. Lenders have already reached out asking questions. Then answer them honestly. He didn't respond immediately. The silence on the line felt different now, less controlled, more unsettled. After he hung up, Madison texted me. Did lenders really call? Yes. A pause. Then, they left a voicemail asking to verify something. I could almost see the world shifting inside her mind. The image of her father, untouchable, brilliant, always in control, was developing cracks. Later that night, the forensic accountant forwarded additional documentation. The LLC loan included aggressive projected revenue numbers tied to properties not yet completed. Madison's name appeared as a minority guarantor to strengthen the profile. Daniel hadn't just hidden financial risk from the board. He had distributed it quietly into his own family. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed, the glow of my laptop lighting the room. Revenge had never been about destroying him. It had been about refusing to be erased. But now, I understood something deeper. This wasn't only about my humiliation under a chandelier. It was about how far Daniel was willing to go to protect his image, even if it meant risking his daughter's future. And once doubt entered Madison's mind, I knew it would not disappear. The conference room felt colder than usual, even under the Texas sun streaming through the glass walls. Daniel sat at the head of the table like he always had, suit pressed, expression composed, fingers lightly folded as if this were just another routine strategy meeting. Around him, the board members avoided direct eye contact, shuffling papers that carried more weight than anyone wanted to admit. I took my seat halfway down the table. This wasn't a family argument anymore. It was a corporate reckoning. Daniel began smoothly. The LLC in question is a strategic expansion vehicle designed to accelerate growth in emerging markets. The projections were ambitious. Yes. but aligned with our long-term goals. He spoke in the same confident tone he used with investors at the anniversary party. One board member cleared her throat. Why was this entity not disclosed in quarterly summaries? It was preliminary, Daniel replied. We didn't want to create confusion before details were finalized. Another voice joined in. Loan guarantees tied to projected revenue are not preliminary details. The air shifted. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly before he recovered. Claire initiated this review, he said, glancing at me. I believe personal circumstances may be influencing the timing. There it was again. The suggestion of revenge. Of emotional instability disguised as corporate concern. I leaned forward calmly. I requested transparency because loan documents reflect liabilities not presented in board reports. This isn't about personal circumstances. It's about disclosure. I slid copies of the forensic summary across the table. Highlighted sections showed inconsistencies between internal revenue projections and figures used to secure the LLC financing. A long silence followed as pages turned. Are these numbers accurate? One member asked Daniel. They're forward-looking estimates, he said sharply. Optimistic but within industry norms. And the personal guarantees. Another pressed. Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second. Standard structuring. I didn't mention Madison's name. Not yet. Midway through the meeting, one of the senior board members leaned back and spoke slowly. We've also received information regarding a property acquisition tied to overlapping fund transfers. Daniel's head snapped up. What property? A luxury condo in downtown Dallas. The board member replied. Purchased under an entity connected to the same financing network. The room went still. That's unrelated, Daniel said quickly. Private investment. Corporate counsel, who had been silent until now, interjected. The concern is whether company-backed funds were indirectly leveraged to support that acquisition. Daniel's composure cracked just slightly. There's no misappropriation, but there is overlap, counsel said carefully. The word hung in the air. For years, Daniel had controlled this room with charm and authority. Now he was answering questions he couldn't redirect. After the formal session ended, several members lingered. Conversations were quieter, more guarded. One board member approached me near the window. If lenders believe there was material misrepresentation, he said softly, they can accelerate repayment clauses. That would strain liquidity across multiple projects. I'm aware, I replied. You understand what that means for employees? For homeowners? I do. That was the part Daniel didn't see. I wasn't trying to burn the company to the ground. I had helped build it from a rented office with 2 folding desks and 1 borrowed computer. I cared about the contractors, the families waiting on their homes. Transparency wasn't destruction. Concealment was, as I gathered my files. Daniel stepped into the hallway behind me. This is a coup, he hissed under his breath. You're orchestrating a takeover. I asked for financial clarity. I said evenly. If that feels like a coup, maybe there's a reason. You're going to destroy everything we built. No, I replied. You risked it when you stopped telling the truth. For the first time since the anniversary party. He didn't have an immediate retort. That evening, an email arrived from corporate counsel. Due to escalating lender inquiries and potential governance concerns, a special session would be held to consider temporary executive leadership adjustments, pending investigation results. Temporary executive leadership adjustments. It was formal language for something Daniel never imagined possible. Suspension. I stood at the hotel window overlooking downtown Dallas, watching traffic crawl below like distant currents. A few weeks ago, he had stood in our mansion and told me to leave his house, his company, his world. Now the board he once controlled was questioning his disclosures. The lenders he courted were requesting documentation. The authority he projected was thinning under scrutiny. My phone lit up with a message from Daniel. You've destroyed my credibility. I typed back only 4 words. You did that yourself? The room he had built his empire in was no longer steady beneath him. And this time, I wasn't the one standing alone. The documents about the condo arrived in my inbox just after midnight. I opened them slowly, already knowing what I would find. The property was a luxury high-rise unit in downtown Dallas, purchased under an entity managed by Elena Ramirez, a real estate agent who had handled several Whitman Custom Homes listings over the past year. What made my chest tighten wasn't the address. It was the transfer trail. Funds had flowed from the undisclosed LLC into a holding account tied to the condo purchase. The same LLC backed by projected revenue from homes that weren't even finished yet. Daniel hadn't just hidden debt from the board. He had used company leverage to fund a private life. I leaned back against the headboard of the hotel bed and let the truth settle. For months, I had noticed the distance, late meetings, trips that ran long, a phone that never left his hand. I had told myself it was pressure from expansion. Now the timeline rearranged itself with brutal clarity. The anniversary party humiliation hadn't been impulsive. It had been strategic. If I were publicly dismissed as unstable or unsupportive, any future claims I raised about financial irregularities could be framed as revenge. He hadn't just tried to remove me from his house. He had tried to remove my credibility. The next morning, my attorney filed an emergency motion to prevent liquidation or transfer of major assets pending completion of the investigation. It was a clean move, procedural, justified, unemotional. If Daniel planned to shift funds or reposition properties before the board vote, this would stop him. By noon, he knew. He called 3 times before I answered. "What have you done?" he demanded. "I've ensured that no assets can be moved until the review is complete. You froze accounts over a misunderstanding. It's not a misunderstanding when there's an undisclosed entity tied to personal property." There was a pause, then a sharp inhale. The condo is an investment, with company-backed projections. It's separate. Then you won't mind explaining the overlap. His voice changed then. Less anger, more strain. You're blowing this out of proportion. Claire, we can settle this privately. That word again. Privately. Quietly. Contained. Not this time, I said. That evening, Madison called. Her voice was unsteady. I heard him arguing with someone, she said. A woman. About money. I didn't respond immediately. He said the audit was because of you, she continued. He said you're trying to ruin him. I asked for transparency. I replied gently. Nothing more. She was quiet for a long moment. Did he really use the company for that condo? I don't have the final report yet, I said carefully. But the documents suggest overlap. She exhaled shakily. He told me it was just business growth. That signing those papers would help secure my future. The irony of that almost hurt. 2 days later, the special board session convened. Daniel presented himself as a victim of domestic retaliation, claiming that personal grievances had escalated into corporate sabotage. He emphasized years of successful growth, awards, expansion milestones. But this time, the room wasn't fully with him. Corporate counsel outlined the compliance inquiry, the lender's requests, the asset freeze motion. The language was careful but unmistakable. Pending full forensic audit, counsel said, the board must consider temporary leadership adjustments to mitigate exposure. Daniel's eyes flicked toward me, anger barely contained. The vote was taken quietly. Suspension pending investigation. For the first time in 2 decades, Daniel Whitman was no longer acting CEO of the company that bore his name. He stood slowly, straightened his jacket, and walked out without speaking to me. Later that night, local business circles began to buzz. Nothing formal yet, but rumors travel faster than press releases. Lenders tightened oversight. Investors requested reassurance calls. My phone lit up with a final message from him. "You've destroyed everything." I stared at the words for a long moment before replying, "No." "You did?" I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. He had believed humiliation would silence me, that pushing me out in front of guests would strip me of power. Instead, it forced the truth into rooms he couldn't control, and now the consequences were no longer in my hands. They were in the hands of auditors, lenders, and a board that finally had to ask the questions I had been asking alone. The news broke on a Tuesday morning. I was sitting in my attorney's office when the local Dallas business channel ran the headline, "Executive Leadership Crisis at Whitman Custom Homes Amid Financial Review." Daniel's name scrolled across the screen beneath the words "Suspended Pending Investigation." For a moment, I simply watched. Weeks earlier, I had stood in our living room while 50 guests watched him erase me with a smile. Now his own reputation was being dissected on television by people who had never set foot in that house. My phone began buzzing almost immediately. Messages from women at church who had avoided eye contact in the grocery store. A neighbor who suddenly wanted to check in. Even one board member's wife sent a cautious note saying she hoped I was holding up. The narrative had shifted. I wasn't the emotional wife who overreacted. I was the spouse who had raised legitimate concerns. Vindication didn't feel loud. It felt quiet and steady. Later that afternoon, the forensic accountant met with my attorney and me to present preliminary conclusions. The numbers were laid out clearly: undisclosed liabilities tied to the LLC, inflated revenue projections used to secure lending, overlapping transfers connected to the downtown condo. "There is sufficient evidence of material misrepresentation," he said calmly. "Whether it rises to civil fraud will depend on lender action." Material misrepresentation. That phrase carried more weight than any argument we had ever had in our kitchen. An emergency court hearing was scheduled regarding the asset freeze and executive control. Daniel arrived in a dark suit, expression set in the familiar mask of confidence. He avoided looking at me as we took our seats. When the judge addressed him directly, asking about the undisclosed entity and projected revenue guarantees, Daniel framed it as aggressive but lawful growth strategy. The forensic expert testified next. He spoke without emotion, outlining discrepancies between internal financial reports and figures presented to lenders. He explained how the LLC's guarantees were structured. He clarified that key disclosures had not been reflected in board minutes. The courtroom felt smaller than the mansion ever had. For the first time, Daniel didn't have a crowd to charm. He had a judge asking precise questions. Madison's written statement was entered into record. She confirmed she had signed documents at her father's request without full explanation of liability exposure. I watched Daniel's jaw tighten as the clerk read her words aloud. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about truth landing where it was meant to, outside the courthouse. Reporters waited at a distance. Daniel walked past them without comment. Later that week, the board convened for a final vote. Corporate counsel advised that maintaining Daniel as CEO during ongoing investigation posed unacceptable risk to lender confidence and company stability. The room that had once echoed with his authority now felt neutral, almost clinical. The vote was unanimous. Daniel Whitman was formally removed as CEO of Whitman Custom Homes. He met me outside the building after the meeting. For a moment, we stood facing each other in the parking lot, the Texas heat pressing down between us. "You're satisfied now?" he asked, his voice hollow. "I asked for transparency," I said. "The rest followed. You've destroyed my empire." I looked at him steadily. An empire built on concealment collapses on its own. He didn't argue. For the first time since the anniversary party, there was no arrogance in his eyes, only exhaustion. Divorce negotiations began almost immediately. The fraud and concealment findings had weakened the prenup's protections. The clause he once treated as impenetrable armor had become negotiable ground. My grandmother's inheritance, my original capital contribution, was now central to asset division. The tables had turned, not through screaming or public spectacle, but through documentation and patience. That night, I returned to the hotel and stood by the window overlooking downtown Dallas. Weeks earlier, I had walked out of my own house under a cloud of humiliation. I had felt small beneath that chandelier. Now the man who tried to erase me had been removed from the company he claimed was solely his. I didn't feel victorious. I felt clear. He had believed that kicking me out would strip me of dignity and power. Instead, it stripped him of control, piece by piece, until there was nothing left to hold on to. The mediation room was smaller than I expected. There were no chandeliers, no polished marble floors, no string quartet pretending not to notice humiliation, just a long wooden table, 2 legal teams, and a stack of documents that would divide 20 years of marriage into columns and percentages. Daniel sat across from me, shoulders slightly curved forward, fingers tapping once against the edge of the table before going still. He didn't look at me at first. For the first time since the anniversary party, there was no audience. My attorney slid the settlement draft toward me. The fraud and concealment findings had altered the structure of everything. The prenup Daniel once treated like a fortress had developed cracks where disclosure obligations had been violated. Certain protections no longer applied. My original capital contribution, funded by my grandmother's inheritance, was formally recognized as separate property that had materially enabled the formation of Whitman Custom Homes. The numbers weren't emotional. They were documented. Daniel's attorney cleared his throat. Mr. Whitman is prepared to resign all executive roles permanently and agree to structured asset redistribution to avoid extended litigation. Avoid extended litigation. He used to love litigation. He used to say courtrooms were just rooms where confident men won. Now he wanted quiet resolution. I signed my name slowly, deliberately, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness. Each letter felt like a closing chapter. I didn't take everything I could have. I took what was rightfully mine. The board had offered me interim executive oversight, citing my founding contribution and steady handling of the investigation. For a moment, I considered it. I had built that company from nothing. I had written early marketing plans at our kitchen table. I had shaken hands with our first hesitant investors. But staying would have tied me to the wreckage of a marriage that had already cost enough. I negotiated a structured buyout of my equity instead. Over time, my stake would convert into liquid assets. Clean. Clear. Final. Daniel signed without looking up. When the meeting ended, he stood, hesitated, then finally met my eyes. I never thought it would end like this, he said. Neither had I. But I also never thought he would stand under a chandelier and tell me to leave his house. I didn't want it to end like this, I replied quietly. I wanted honesty. He nodded once, as if that word carried more weight now than it ever had before. A week later, I returned to the mansion one last time. It was quiet, staged for potential buyers. The furniture had been partially removed. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, landing in familiar patterns across the marble floor. I walked into the living room where the anniversary party had taken place. I could almost see it again, the guests, the champagne glasses, the polite silence when Daniel told me to leave. I remembered the heat rising to my face, the brief flicker of doubt, the moment I chose not to break. The house felt smaller now. It had never been power. It had been a symbol. Control had never been love. It had been leverage. I ran my hand lightly over the staircase railing before turning away. Madison had started texting me more often. Not daily. Not fully reconciled. But cautiously open. The illusion she once held about her father had shifted into something more complex. I didn't rush her. Trust, once fractured, grows slowly. Daniel's name continued to circulate in business columns for a while. Words like investigation, compliance review, and executive removal followed him. Eventually, the headlines moved on. Reputation, I learned, is loud when it rises and quiet when it falls. I moved into a smaller home closer to downtown Dallas. No grand entrance. No dramatic staircase. Just a space that felt entirely mine. The first night there, I sat on the floor surrounded by half-unpacked boxes and felt something unexpected. Peace. Not triumph. Not revenge. Peace. Revenge had never meant screaming or exposing him in front of cameras. It meant refusing to be erased. It meant understanding the contracts I signed, the money I contributed, the clauses he overlooked. It meant preparation. Being thrown out in front of guests had felt like the end of my life as I knew it. It was the beginning of reclaiming it. If you've ever been humiliated in your own home, dismissed in your own marriage, or told that you don't understand the very life you helped build. I hope you remember this. Dignity isn't something someone else grants you. It's something you protect quietly until the moment comes to stand firm. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever experienced a moment when the tables turned, not because you shouted louder, but because you prepared smarter? Share your story in the comments. Your voice might be exactly what another woman needs to hear. And if you believe in stories where hidden strength wins over public humiliation, stay with this channel. Subscribe and come back for more stories about justice, family drama, and the quiet power that changes everything. He thought kicking me out would erase me. It only gave me the space to rebuild, on my own terms.